Turning back to Alejandra, she was 12. She was on the cusp of adolescence. She had had a tragedy precipitate her suffering. But what we find is that for many, many teens, there isn't always a tragic event that precipitates the inner depression. And in fact, it appears to be normative that about 70% of late adolescents by junior year have had a depression, with or without an outward event. Very often, it's a call from inside. Those nagging questions of what's my meaning, what's my purpose, are very real, and they're seeking answers. So they go to philosophy, and then they go to theology, and they search and they search and they search with the head. And the head alone is not answering the question. And the downward spiral, like clockwork, you can see in half the sophomore class, the despair, the lack of answer. This form of depression is very often a knock at the door that's part of spiritual quest. It's the banging at the door to go inward. There's not a lot on college campuses, by and large, to help them answer that knock at the door, but there can be, and there certainly is here in this building. I agree so heartily with your presentation that the faith-based community has a very powerful role in answering the knock at the door. It is, in every tradition on earth, understood that with adolescence, and specifically puberty, there is an awakening of spiritual hunger and spiritual knowing. Whether it's confirmation, bar bat mitzvah, the inipi, the Sundance, humans have known through time the knock at the door must be supported. So how can we do that? Regardless of where we are, relationships can be understood as spiritual events. Regardless of where we are, inner practices of reflection, prayer, journeying, help the teen hear the heart and respond to the nagging questions. We can do this. We can support them in their quest. And if we do, we are setting them up to have an entirely different way of leaning in, whether it's neurophysiologically, experientially, whatever lens we want to use to look upon their way of journeying. We are setting them up to have an entirely different type of life, where losses are truly both painful and opportunities, where people who are difficult are there just for us, and where instead of seeing life as what can I get, and how great can I look, and how well can I perform, it is the most extraordinary opportunity of love and connection. One way that teens have been supported outside of faith-based communities is through mindfulness, and mindfulness is a nice start. A quieting of the mind, a paying attention, and as you know, it's drawn from the rich contemplative traditions. In an attempt to see how we can support teens in all sorts of settings, we asked the question, hey, what do the people with the red heads, the people with a sustained spirituality, have in common with, say, meditators? And what we found when we looked across the literature was that people with a sustained personal spirituality in a Judeo-Christian tradition showed the same cortical thickening, the same biological changes that were found in experienced meditators outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition in a different part of the world in its own powerful tradition. So whether it's prayer or meditation, the brain changed in the same way. It raises the question of whether we are opening a door when we support adolescents in meditation, prayer, whatever the contemplative practice might be. And where exactly shall we tell them that they're going in a universal way? So the rich traditions of the world have much to say, but I'll add a note from science. The very same people who through a sustained, strong spirituality showed cortical thickening were also invited back into our lab for a different study, to look not at the structure of the brain, but what the brain gave off, the energy given off by the brain using EEG. And what we found was that people with sustained spirituality gave off a wavelength, high amplitude alpha, and they particularly gave it off if they had recovered in their life from depression through a deepening of spirituality. High amplitude alpha is often found on the back of the head of a meditating monk. High amplitude alpha is also found off the head of someone to recover from depression through Prozac. And that's a very popular medication, right? It appears that Prozac may boot up, physiologically force, what organically is derived through the depressive process of spiritual awakening and deepening. That the knock at the door is an opportunity for a developmental process. It is in fact a developmental depression that ushers in spiritual quest and leads to a form of spirituality that informs all other lines of development. And while I certainly would allow my child who's deeply suffering to be medicated, I would not end the day with that. I would support, with that knock on the door, the deep spiritual individuation of answering the head with the heart. So again, where do we tell the questing teen that they're going? Where is it that this meditation or prayer is taking them? Science has a suggestion. Told in the language of science, the meditating monk, the experienced meditator, the one who prays, they all have high amplitude alpha coming off the back of their head. There's another place that that very same wavelength is found. It happens to go by another name in another field. It's Schumann's constant. And it's the wavelength at the Earth's crust. The spiritually engaged brain vibrates with the Earth's crust. And the experience of oneness seems to be accurate. So I look at my kids, and I think by the time their kids are scientists, not that I have any say, they'll laugh. And they'll say, Grandma used to measure spirit consciousness with its wavelength. But I think we can invite adolescents into that very, very deep quest, because they are perhaps the very best among us. Maybe they are the mystics among us in our developmental path, hungering and knowing for the rest of us, helping us all tune in. And I invite very much your thoughts and questions on how we can support our youth towards spiritual fulfillment and thriving. Thank you.